The silence of deep space is total, and the human mind was never built to endure it. In July of 1969, astronaut Michael Collins met that silence alone, high above the far side of the Moon. On every orbit he passed behind the Moon and lost all contact with Earth. 3 facts make his situation stranger than it sounds. Space itself carries no sound at all. Sound is a pressure wave, and it needs matter to travel. Deep space holds as little as 1 atom in each cubic centimeter, far too empty to carry it. Yet no astronaut ever hears that silence directly, because inside the suit his own breathing floods his ears. And rooms built on Earth to erase sound can unsettle a person within minutes. For a long time, scientists treated silence as harmless, a simple absence of sound. What they found was the opposite. A mind placed in true quiet does not rest. Starved of input, the brain begins to supply its own. This film follows that discovery, from the physics of a soundless vacuum to the scientists who removed the world on purpose. If you enjoy long, careful journeys through the physics and psychology of the universe, consider subscribing to Gravity of Sleep. The story begins with a question physicists had to settle first. What is sound, and why does a vacuum refuse to carry it? Consider what sound actually is. On Earth, every sound you have ever heard was carried by matter in motion. A voice pushes against the air compresses, then stretches, then compresses again. That moving pattern of pressure spreads outward in all directions. Your eardrum feels it arrive, and your brain reads it as sound. Take away the air, and there is nothing left to push. The voice still moves the vocal cords, but the message has no road to travel. A sound wave is a relay between molecules. One particle bumps the next, which bumps the next, passing the energy along. The denser the material, the faster and cleaner that relay runs. Sound moves quickly through water and faster still through steel. It moves through air more slowly, because the molecules sit farther apart. Follow that logic outward, and you arrive at deep space. There the molecules are so scarce that the relay breaks down entirely. The number is difficult to picture. In the space between the stars, there may be only 1 atom in a single cubic centimeter. On Earth, that same tiny volume of air holds a number of molecules with far too many digits to say aloud. Down here the molecules are packed shoulder to shoulder, colliding constantly, again and again each second. Out there a single atom may drift for a long time before it ever meets another. A pressure wave needs those collisions to move. Without them, it has nowhere to go. This is why the old image of a roaring explosion in space is wrong. Imagine a star tearing itself apart, or 2 ships colliding in the dark. The event would be violent beyond description. It would flood space with light and radiation and hurl debris. But an ear floating nearby would receive none of it as sound. The blast would have no air to shake. Even a detonation close beside you in deep space would arrive in perfect silence. The light would blind you. The silence would remain unbroken. So space is not quiet because something blocks the sound. It is quiet because there is almost nothing there to carry sound in the first place. Silence is not laid over deep space like a blanket. It is the natural state of a place with no medium at all. And that fact creates a strange problem for anyone who has heard the famous recordings. Many people have listened to what they were told is the sound of space. If space is truly soundless, then what exactly were they hearing? The answer is that they were not hearing sound. They were hearing a translation. Spacecraft and telescopes gather signals that are not sound waves at all. They collect radio waves, the vibrations of plasma, and bursts of X-ray energy. These are patterns in electromagnetic energy and charged gas. Scientists take that data and map it onto pitch and volume. A stronger signal might become a louder tone. A faster vibration might become a higher note. The result is called a sonification. It is a picture drawn in sound, built from information that was never sound to begin with. The most famous example came from a spacecraft far from home. In 2012, Voyager 1 reached the boundary where the sun's influence fades into interstellar space. As it crossed, its instruments measured vibrations in the dense plasma around it. Scientists converted those plasma waves into a tone the human ear could follow. The result was an eerie whistle. It has been shared countless times as the actual sound of interstellar space. But it is not sound traveling through the vacuum. It is an electromagnetic measurement, turned into a signal we can hear. The difference becomes clear when a real sound is finally captured. A NASA lander named InSight touched down on Mars and placed a seismometer on the ground. Mars is not open space. It holds a thin but genuine atmosphere, and it has solid ground that can shake. The lander recorded real mechanical vibrations, the movement of Martian wind and the trembling of the planet itself. Those were true sounds, carried by a real medium, the same way sound is carried on Earth. The whistle of Voyager and the wind of Mars sound similar to us. Only one of them was ever really a sound. That distinction matters, because humans have spent decades trying to build true silence on Earth. If space will not share its silence with us, we have tried to manufacture our own. The tool for this is called an anechoic chamber. The word means a room without echo. Its purpose is to absorb sound so completely that almost nothing reflects back. The most famous of these rooms sits inside Orfield Labs in Minneapolis. Its walls are lined with wedges of fiberglass more than 3 feet thick. Behind the wedges stand double walls of insulated steel. Around all of it sits a foot of concrete. Layer by layer, the outside world is stripped away. The room absorbs 99.99% of the sound produced inside it. Guinness World Records certified it as the quietest place on Earth, first in 2004 and again in 2012. Stepping inside is deeply disorienting. With no echo returning to you, the space feels wrong to the body. Your footsteps make almost no sound. Your voice seems to die the instant it leaves your mouth. And in that absence, quieter sounds rise to take its place. Visitors report hearing their own heartbeat as a steady thud. Some say they can hear the blood moving through their veins. There is often a faint high ringing, a hiss with no source in the room. According to the lab that built it, no visitor has ever remained inside alone for longer than 45 minutes. That record did not stand forever. In 2015, a new room claimed the title. It is an anechoic chamber inside Microsoft's Building 87 in Redmond, Washington. Its measured sound level reached about 20 decibels below zero on the standard scale. To understand that, remember that 0 decibels is roughly the softest sound a healthy human ear can detect. This room sits quieter than that threshold by around 20 decibels. It is, by measurement, quieter than the limit of human hearing itself. These rooms gave silence a strange reputation. A popular story took hold that the quietest place on Earth drives people mad. The claim is specific and dramatic. Spend 15 to 45 minutes alone in the dark of such a chamber, the story goes, and you will begin to hallucinate. It is repeated so often that many people treat it as settled fact. But when acoustic scientists looked closely, the story began to fall apart. The writer and acoustic engineer Trevor Cox has traced where the hallucination claim came from. Much of it leads back to a single disputed study, whose findings are far from certain. The psychologist Vaughan Bell has pointed out the same weakness. The eerie things people report inside these rooms are, for the most part, entirely real. Hearing your own blood is not a hallucination. It is a real sound your body always makes, one the noisy world normally hides. The faint high hiss is real too. It can come from the spontaneous firing of the nerves in the ear, a signal with no outside cause. The people who work in these rooms tell a calmer story than the legend. An engineer at Salford University spent more than 20 years around anechoic chambers. In all that time, they had never encountered a genuine case of hallucination. The science communicator known for the channel Veritasium sat inside the Orfield chamber for about an hour. He did not descend into madness. He grew uncomfortable and aware of his own body, but he remained himself. The silence was strange. It was not destroying. And yet something in the reaction is real, even if the legend exaggerates it. A mind left in deep quiet does turn inward. It notices what it usually ignores. To understand why, we have to leave the anechoic chamber and enter a different kind of room. In the middle of the last century, scientists began removing the world from human volunteers on purpose. They wanted to know what a mind does when the senses go dark. Their work would become some of the most revealing research ever done on the human mind. It did not begin in space. It began in a quiet room at a university in Montreal, where students were paid to do almost nothing at all. They lay still, cut off from sight and sound and touch, expecting little more than a long stretch of boredom. What happened to them instead arrived far sooner than anyone predicted. Within a single day, the empty room began to fill with things that were not there. That story, and the strange science it launched, is where the silence stops being physics and becomes something closer to a warning. The man behind that room was a psychologist named Donald Hebb. He worked at McGill University in Montreal. The year was 1951. His funding came from an unusual source. Canada's Defence Research Board gave him a grant of $10,000. The military wanted to understand what isolation does to a person. Hebb was chasing something more fundamental. He wanted to see what the brain does when the world goes quiet. His method was simple and strange. He paid student volunteers $20 a day. In return, they had to do almost nothing. Each subject lay on a bed inside a small chamber. Over their eyes went translucent goggles. The goggles admitted only a soft, formless light. There were no shapes to see. Over their hands went stiff cardboard cuffs. The cuffs blocked the sense of touch. A steady wash of white noise filled the ears. Sight, touch, and hearing were all smeared into nothing. The pay was generous for the era. Many students expected an easy stretch of rest. They thought they would sleep, or think, or drift through long, empty hours. The study was designed to run for 6 weeks. Hebb assumed the volunteers would last. He was wrong by an enormous margin. The mind does not tolerate an empty world for long. The first changes came fast. Within about 24 hours, the volunteers began to hallucinate. Their brains conjured images with no source. One subject heard a music box playing a tune. Another felt himself struck by pellets. The pellets seemed to come from a tiny rocket he imagined firing at him. None of it was real. All of it felt real to the mind producing it. These were not tired people mistaking shadows. Their brains were manufacturing an entire world from nothing. Starved of input, the mind refused to sit in the dark. It reached inward and built the missing signals itself. Almost no subject lasted more than a few days. The 6-week plan collapsed within hours. People fled a room that asked nothing of them. This is the finding that turns silence into a warning. The brain is not a passive receiver. It does not wait calmly for the world to speak. It is a prediction engine, always expecting a flow of sensation. When that flow stops, the brain does not stop with it. It keeps generating a reality. It fills the void with invention. The implications reached far beyond one Montreal basement. If a padded room could unravel a student in a day, what would the true emptiness of space do? A traveler in deep space would face a silence more total than any laboratory. There would be no music box to imagine away. There would only be the vacuum, the mind and time. Hebb had opened a door, and others walked through it. A few years later, another scientist took the idea further. His name was John C. Lilly. In 1954, Lilly built something new. He built the first sensory deprivation float tank. His goal was to strip away sensation almost completely. The tank was elegant in its cruelty. A person floated in salt water held at body temperature. The water matched the skin so closely that the body seemed to vanish. There was no up, no down, no pressure, no weight. The tank sat in total darkness. It sat in total silence. Nearly every external signal was removed at once. Lilly wanted to study consciousness itself. He believed that if he removed the world, he could observe the mind alone. So he became his own first subject. He climbed into the tank and let the darkness close over him. What he found was not peace. He reported that the conditions could produce vivid hallucinations. Alone in the water, his mind began to speak in images. Lilly did not stop at silence and darkness. His later experiments grew far more extreme. He combined the isolation of the tank with powerful drugs. He took LSD inside the tank. He took ketamine inside the tank. He pushed his own consciousness into places few would follow. His work drifted from careful science towards something stranger. But his early tank had already proven Hebb's point. Remove the world, and the mind does not go blank. It goes wild. The float tank and the padded chamber told the same story. Human consciousness is built to process a flood of input. When the flood dries up, the system does not idle quietly. It hallucinates the river it has lost. Now hold these findings against the reality of a real spacecraft. This is where the story takes an unexpected turn. You might expect that engineers, knowing all this, built silent ships. You might imagine a spacecraft as a floating anechoic chamber. The truth is almost the opposite. The place humans actually live in space is not quiet at all. Consider the International Space Station. It is the closest ongoing human analogue to living in space. It circles the planet in what scientists call low Earth orbit. Crews live aboard it for months at a time, and its interior is never silent, not for a single second of any day. The station hums with the sound of its own survival. Its life support systems must run without pause. Fans move the air so that exhaled breath does not pool. Pumps push water and coolant through the walls. Generators and machinery run day and night. All of that hardware makes noise. The result is a constant background roar. The measured level is about 72 A-weighted decibels. That is not a gentle hum. It is comparable to highway traffic. Imagine standing roughly 15 meters from a busy road. That steady wall of sound is what astronauts hear. They hear it while they work. They hear it while they eat. They hear it while they try to sleep. There is a strange irony buried in this fact. On Earth, we imagine space as the ultimate quiet. Beyond the hull lies the most perfect silence in the universe. Inside the hull, the crew cannot escape the noise. Only the thin wall of the ship separates absolute silence from a constant drone. Beyond that wall lies a vacuum no human can survive. The noise inside is the price of staying alive. That price is not only discomfort. The noise leaves marks on the human body. 72 decibels sits below the usual danger line for hearing. On Earth, the occupational threshold is around 87 decibels. By that measure, the station should be safe. But the station breaks the ordinary rules of exposure. The danger is not how loud the sound is. The danger is that it never stops. Workers on Earth go home at the end of a shift. They step into quieter rooms and let their ears recover. An astronaut has no such escape. The noise surrounds them around the clock, for months on end. Some Russian cosmonauts have paid a lasting cost. After long missions, some showed measurable hearing loss. For some it was temporary, for others it did not fully return. So the mind in space faces a cruel double bind. Perfect silence, the kind that unravels a person in a padded room, waits just beyond the wall. Ceaseless noise, the kind that erodes the ear over months, fills the space within. Neither option is kind to a human being. The universe offers a void that would break the brain. Human engineering answers with a roar that wears down the body. And yet the deepest wound of space may be neither the silence nor the noise. It may be the distance. To see why, it helps to compare two very different kinds of confinement. Both remove a person from the ordinary world. Both push the mind toward its limits. But they do so in opposite ways. The first is the submarine. A crew lives through a long patrol beneath the ocean. The hull is cramped. The view is non-existent. The days blur into a grey sameness. And crucially, the submarine is quiet. The crew endures a genuine acoustic hush. They live inside a sensory monotony, a world with almost nothing new to hear. The second is the spacecraft. Here the problem is reversed. The astronaut is trapped inside constant mechanical noise. There is no hush, no monotony of silence. There is only the endless drone of the machines that keep them breathing. One group has too little sound, the other has too much. By the logic of the padded chamber, they should suffer differently. Silence should break one, and noise should wear down the other. But the studies reveal something stranger. Both groups develop remarkably similar strain. The isolation reaches them through different doors, yet it arrives all the same. This points to a subtle and important truth. The enemy may not be silence itself. The enemy may not be noise itself. What wounds the mind is the loss of control over its own world. It is the loss of choice over what to hear and whom to see. A person on Earth can change their surroundings. They can seek quiet or seek company. They can open a window or step outside. The submariner and the astronaut cannot. Their sensory world is fixed and inescapable. It is chosen for them by the machine that holds them. That helplessness, more than any level of loudness, seems to be the true burden. There is one final clue to how the brain treats an empty soundscape. It comes from people who live with tinnitus. Tinnitus is the perception of a sound that has no external source. For many, it is a constant ringing or hiss. Scientists have watched the tinnitus brain during moments of external silence. They used a method that reads activity in the auditory cortex. In most people, silence lets that region grow calm. In people with tinnitus, it does not. The auditory cortex stays hyperactive. It behaves as if a real sound were still playing. This offers a haunting hint about the nature of silence. For some minds, quiet is not an absence. It is a stage on which the brain performs its own sound. The ear stops delivering signals, but the cortex refuses to rest. It fills the vacancy with a noise of its own making. Silence, in that state, can feel strangely loud. All of this was learned on Earth. It was learned in basements and tanks and steel hulls. It was learned by people who could always, in the end, walk back out into the world. But a handful of human beings went somewhere the researchers could not follow. They left the Earth entirely. They travelled far enough that home shrank to a small point of light. And when they did, they began to describe a feeling no chamber could produce. It was not quite fear. It was something older and larger. To hear it in their own words, we have to go back to the first humans who ever travelled to the moon. In December of 1968, 3 men rode a rocket beyond the reach of Earth's gravity. They were the crew of Apollo 8. They were the first humans ever to leave our planet's pull entirely. They were the first to be captured by the gravity of another world. Ahead of them waited the moon. Behind them, the Earth began to shrink into the black. No one had done this before. No one had watched the whole planet recede into a single window. The 3 astronauts circled the moon 10 times. They passed again and again over craters no human eye had ever seen up close, and on Christmas Eve they turned on a camera and spoke to the world. It was the first live television broadcast ever sent from lunar orbit. On Earth, an enormous audience gathered around glowing screens. The astronauts aimed the lens down at the grey and lifeless ground below them. Then one of the crew described the place in his own plain words. His name was Jim Lovell. He was looking at a desolation no person had ever narrated live. He called the vast loneliness up there at the moon awe-inspiring. He said it made you realize just what you have back there on Earth. The sentence was quiet. It was also one of the earliest human reactions to true distance. Notice what he chose to emphasize. He did not describe the moon. He described the loneliness of being near it. He described the feeling of the Earth being far away. That instinct would repeat in nearly every account that followed. The mind, confronted with the void, turns immediately back toward home. There is a strange detail hidden inside these accounts. The astronaut is never surrounded by silence in the way we imagine. Remember the vacuum outside the suit. A few inches beyond the visor, sound cannot exist at all. But inside the helmet, the astronaut is never alone with quiet. Chris Hadfield described this precisely. During a spacewalk, a working astronaut wears a voice-activated microphone. His hearing becomes absolutely dominated by his own breathing. The vacuum a hand's width away is perfectly silent. The space inside his helmet never is. He floats between two impossible extremes at once. This is the paradox at the center of the story. Deep space offers a silence more complete than any chamber on Earth, yet no human has ever actually heard it. A living body carries its own noise everywhere it travels. The lungs, the heart, the pulse behind the ear. The true silence stays just outside the glass, forever untouched. So the loneliness Lovell described was not a loneliness of sound. It was a loneliness of position. It was the mind becoming aware of distance itself. And no one in history would feel that awareness more sharply than a single man, 7 months later, orbiting the moon entirely alone. In July of 1969, Apollo 11 carried 3 astronauts to the moon. 2 of them are remembered by almost everyone. Neil Armstrong and Buzz Aldrin descended to the surface. They left the first human footprints in the lunar dust. The whole world watched them and held its breath. The third man did not land. His name was Michael Collins. He stayed behind in the command module, a spacecraft named Columbia. His task was to orbit the moon alone. He would keep the vehicle ready for the journey home. While 2 men made history on the surface, 1 man circled above them in silence. Each orbit carried him around the far side of the moon. And on the far side, the moon itself stood between Collins and the Earth. Its mass blocked every radio wave. For roughly 47 to 48 minutes of each 2-hour orbit, all contact simply vanished. No word from Earth. No word from Armstrong and Aldrin. Nothing but the hum of his own craft. Consider what that blackout truly meant. Billions of people lived on the planet far below him. 2 more stood on the grey surface beneath his path. And for those minutes, not one of them could reach him. He was the most isolated human being who had ever lived. The nearest people were a world away, on the wrong side of a mountain of rock. Mission Control noticed the weight of the moment. As Collins swung behind the moon, a controller marked it with a single line. "Not since Adam," he said, "has any human known such solitude as Mike Collins is experiencing." It was not an exaggeration. It was very close to the literal truth. Collins himself understood exactly where he was. He wrote about it later in plain and unforgettable words. "I am alone now," he said. "Truly alone, and absolutely isolated from any known life. I am it." 4 short thoughts, a complete map of human distance. Read that final phrase again. I am it. On his side of the moon, he was the only living thing for hundreds of thousands of miles. No basement chamber could manufacture that. No float tank could imitate it. His isolation was not an experimental setting. It was a fact of physics and geometry. And yet something remarkable happened in those minutes. Collins did not describe terror. He described a strange and private calm. He had instruments to watch and a rendezvous to prepare. His solitude had a purpose, and purpose changes almost everything about how the mind endures it. This is one of the quiet lessons of the whole story. The mind does not break simply from being alone. It strains when isolation has no meaning and no clear end. Collins knew his silence would last minutes, not months. He knew his crewmates would rise back over the horizon. His blackout was total, but it was bounded. Every time Columbia came around the near side again, the radio crackled back to life. Voices returned. The Earth reappeared. The solitude released its grip almost as soon as it had closed. Collins later admitted he did not feel fear during those passes. He felt awareness. He felt the sheer scale of the emptiness that held him. That scale is difficult to hold in the mind. Beneath him lay a dead world of craters and shadow. Above him stretched a sky with no air to soften it. The stars did not twinkle. They stood fixed and hard against the black. And through all of it, the deep silence pressed against the hull. close enough to touch and impossible to hear. Compare his experience with the volunteers in the darkened chambers on Earth. They lasted hours or days before the mind rebelled. Collins passed through a silence far more absolute and stayed steady. The difference was not toughness. The difference was structure. He had a task, a schedule, and a certain end. The researchers had learnt the same truth from the opposite direction. Remove all structure and meaning, and even a few days become unbearable. Keep the mind anchored to a purpose, and it can hold against a genuinely inhuman void. Silence alone does not defeat a person. Silence without purpose or limit is what does the damage. Collins returned safely. He rejoined his crew above the moon and rode home with them. His minutes of perfect isolation became a footnote beside the footprints on the surface, but those minutes told astronomers and psychologists something the surface never could. They revealed what a human mind does when the world drops entirely out of reach. Yet even his blackout was brief. It measured in minutes, and it ended on a fixed and knowable schedule. The story now turns toward a far harder kind of distance. The next travelers will not vanish for minutes at a time. They will vanish for months, then years, across the empty space between two planets. Their silence will not lift when a spacecraft crests a horizon. It will stretch and thin as the Earth shrinks to a pale dot behind them. Their signals home will arrive late, then later still. And before anyone dares that journey, its dangers had to be rehearsed. On the ground, in deserts, inside sealed domes built to break the mind on purpose, and to learn exactly how it breaks. The idea did not begin with astronauts. It began in a small room at McGill University in Montreal in 1951. A psychologist named Donald Hebb wanted to know what a mind does with nothing to work on. Canada's Defence Research Board handed him a grant of $10,000. He used it to erase the senses, one channel at a time. His volunteers were students, paid $20 a day to do almost nothing. They lay in a cramped chamber for as long as they could bear it. Over their eyes went translucent goggles. Light still reached them, but only as a soft and shapeless glow. Over their hands went stiff cardboard cuffs. Touch became a memory of touch. A steady wash of white noise filled their ears. Sound was present, yet it carried no information at all. Every path to the world was left open and made useless. Hebb had designed the study to run for 6 weeks. Almost no one lasted more than a few days. The mind, it turned out, refuses to sit quietly in an empty room. Within about 24 hours, the volunteers began to hallucinate. Deprived of real input, the brain began to manufacture its own. One student heard a music box playing where no music box existed. Another felt himself struck by pellets, fired from a tiny rocket he could only imagine. These were not the reports of troubled people. They were ordinary students. The images simply arrived, uninvited, out of the blank. The lesson unsettled everyone who read it. A healthy brain starved of the world does not grow calm. It fills the silence with invention. It would rather build a false reality than endure no reality at all. 3 years later, another researcher pushed the idea much further. His name was John Lilly. In 1954, he built the first sensory deprivation float tank. Hebb had dimmed the senses. Lilly set out to remove them almost entirely. A person floated in salt water warmed to the temperature of the body. The water held them without effort, so even the pull of weight seemed to fade. The tank was sealed into total darkness and total silence. There was nothing to see. There was nothing to hear. There was barely anything left to feel. Lilly wanted to know what consciousness does when the outside world is subtracted from it. He often used himself as the subject. And what he found matched Hebb's chamber. In the absence of everything, the mind did not rest. It produced vivid hallucinations, rich and strange and entirely internal. Lilly's later experiments grew more extreme. He combined the isolation of the tank with LSD, and then with ketamine. But the first and simplest finding was the one that mattered. Remove the world, and the world does not go quiet. It comes rushing back from the inside. These early studies shared a single quiet conclusion. Silence and darkness are not neutral. They are not merely the absence of noise and light. To a human brain, they are a kind of pressure. The mind is built to model the world without pause. Take the world away, and the model does not stop. It keeps running, with no fresh data to correct it. That is why deep isolation feels less like peace, and more like a slow unmooring. This is the problem that would one day stand between Earth and Mars. A crew bound for another planet cannot be tested in advance, so the danger has to be rehearsed in places that resemble it. On Earth, that has meant the most hostile and empty ground available. It has meant polar stations through the long sunless winter. It has meant submarines sealed beneath the sea for months. And it has meant a bare volcanic slope in Hawaii. High on the flanks of Mauna Loa, NASA built a dome. The ground around it is red and lifeless, chosen because it looks like Mars. Inside that dome, roughly 1,200 square feet of floor held a crew of 6. Between 2013 and 2016, successive teams sealed themselves inside for missions of increasing length. First for 4 months, then for 8, then for a full 12. The program was called High Seas. Its purpose was not engineering, it was the human mind under confinement. Whenever a crew member stepped outside, they wore a mock spacesuit, exactly as they would on Mars. There was no quick escape and no casual contact with the world. Researchers watched how mood, thinking, and cooperation held together as the weeks stretched into months. What the analog missions revealed was a strange and repeatable pattern. It does not appear at the start of an isolation. It appears after the halfway point. Researchers call it the third quarter phenomenon. Something shifts once a crew crosses the psychological midpoint of their confinement. In that moment, a hard truth arrives. As much isolation still lies ahead as has already been endured. Sleep begins to suffer. Mood darkens. Thinking grows less sharp. Small frictions between people sharpen into real conflict. The same pattern shows up in Antarctic crews wintering over. It shows up in submarine patrols. And it shows up inside the Mars domes. Polar researchers describe something stranger still. They call it the Antarctic stare. It is a fugue-like drift of attention, a mind wandering somewhere the eyes cannot follow. A person sits present in body while their awareness thins out. Focus fades. The scene in front of them loses its grip. It is the far quieter cousin of Hebb's hallucinations. The same starved brain, set down in a real and dangerous place, simply slipping loose from the moment. There is a revealing contrast buried in all of this. Submarine crews and astronauts face nearly opposite conditions. A submariner lives inside genuine acoustic quiet and dull, unbroken monotony. An astronaut lives trapped in constant mechanical noise. One endures silence, the other never hears it. And yet both groups develop the same isolation strain. That single fact points to something important. The mind is not broken by silence itself. What wears it down is the loss of control, the loss of a familiar sensory world, and the loss of easy contact with other people. Whether the room is roaring or perfectly still seems to matter less than whether the mind can still reach someone. And that is exactly where the journey to Mars becomes something entirely new. On the domes of Mauna Loa, a crew was still on Earth. Help was near, even if it was pretended away. A door could open, a voice could answer at once. On the way to Mars, that nearness disappears completely. Consider what distance does to a simple conversation. A signal to the moon crosses the gap in about 1 1/3 seconds. A signal to Mars is far less forgiving. Depending on where the two planets sit in their orbits, one message takes anywhere from 3 to 22 minutes to arrive. A reply takes just as long to come back. Real conversation becomes impossible. A crew member could call for help and then wait most of an hour to hear a single answer. Every word from home would arrive already old. Every question sent to Earth would be overtaken by events before the reply returned. This delay is not a minor inconvenience. Engineers and aerospace researchers count it among the heaviest psychological burdens of the entire mission. It is a silence of a different kind. Not the silence of a vacuum, but the silence of distance itself. The crew would still hear the fans and the pumps around them. The machinery would still hum without pause, as it does on the station today. But the human world, the one made of quick replies and shared moments, would fall out of reach and stay there. So the picture begins to assemble itself. Heb showed that a brain robbed of input will invent its own. Lilly showed that even a body floating in warm and perfect stillness cannot keep the mind quiet. The analog crews showed that isolation does its worst damage not at the outset, but past the midpoint, when the far shore feels as distant as the one left behind. The submariners and the astronauts together showed that the true stressor is not loud or soft, but the loss of a graspable world. A Mars crew would carry all of these at once. They would have the confinement of the dome, but with no dome to leave. They would have the monotony of the submarine, and the mechanical roar of the station, stacked one atop the other. They would cross the psychological midpoint somewhere in the dark between two worlds, with Earth too far to help and the destination still too far to reach. And around them, just beyond the thin skin of the ship, would lie the one silence none of the experiments could ever fully copy. The genuine absolute quiet of a place where sound has no medium to move through at all. That combination has never been tested on a living crew. Not by Apollo, whose longest voyages lasted days. Not by High Seas, whose crews were always minutes from rescue. It waits, unrehearsed, for the first travelers who commit to the crossing. Consider what distance alone does to a human voice. A radio signal is the fastest messenger that physics permits. It crosses the gap between the Earth and the Moon in about 1 1/3 seconds. A crew there can still hold something close to a conversation. The delay is short enough to feel like a poor telephone line. Mars breaks that comfort completely. A single message from Earth to Mars takes between about 3 and 22 minutes to arrive. The exact figure depends on where the two planets sit in their orbits. When they are near, the wait is only a few minutes. When they are far, a spoken word takes more than 20 minutes to land, and the reply takes just as long to return. This means real conversation becomes physically impossible. A Mars crew cannot ask a question and hear an answer. They can only send a message and wait. By the time a cry for help reaches home, the emergency it described may already be over. NASA researchers treat this delay as one of the deepest psychological stresses of any Mars mission. It is not the same as the silence of the vacuum. It is a silence made of waiting. The line to home is never truly cut. It is simply stretched until it stops being a line at all. Think about what that does to the mind we followed into the submarine and the station. Those crews were isolated, but never unreachable. A submariner could surface. A station astronaut could speak to Houston and hear a human voice come back within a heartbeat. The Mars traveler loses even that. The nearest listening ear drifts millions of miles behind the ship. Every problem must be solved alone, in the moment, with no elder voice to lean on. The confinement is physical. The abandonment is temporal. Help exists, but it exists in the past. And yet the strangest cruelty of silence is not out there in the gap. It lies inside the skull. The brain did not evolve to sit in quiet. It evolved to listen. When the outside world falls silent, the listening does not stop. It turns inward and searches for something to hear. Brain imaging has begun to show this directly. Researchers have studied people who live with tinnitus, the condition of hearing a sound that has no source. Using a method that measures blood flow in the brain, they watch the auditory cortex during moments of external silence. In a person without tinnitus, that region grows calmer when sound disappears. It rests. In a person with tinnitus, it does the opposite. During silence, the auditory cortex stays switched on. It behaves as if a real sound were still playing. The quiet does not soothe it. The quiet provokes it. This is one proposed reason a truly silent room can feel loud. The brain expects a signal. When none arrives, part of it refuses to accept the emptiness. It manufactures a presence to fill the space. The hiss, the ringing, the sense of a sound just beneath hearing. These are not always failures of the ear. Sometimes they are the mind insisting that the world should still be speaking to it. Here the sealed room and the open vacuum finally meet. Both remove almost every external sound. Both leave the listener alone with the machinery of hearing itself. In the quietest chambers, a person begins to notice the pulse of their own blood and the faint activity of the nerve that carries sound. In deep space, a working astronaut hears the same intimate roar of breath and heartbeat that Chris Hadfield described. The environments could not be more different. One is a small box in a city, the other is the widest emptiness that exists. But the experience converges. Strip away the world, and the body becomes the only thing left to hear. There is a name that isolation researchers give to one of the stranger mental states this can produce. They call it the Antarctic stare. It appears in crews who have spent long months in polar stations, cut off through the sunless winter. The stare is a kind of drift. Attention loosens its grip. A person gazes at nothing, their awareness dulled, their thoughts uncoupled from the room around them. It is not sleep, and it is not panic. It is the mind quietly withdrawing from a world that has stopped offering it anything new. That withdrawal tends to deepen at a particular point in a long confinement. Researchers have mapped it across Antarctic winters, submarine patrols, and Mars analog missions. They call it the third quarter phenomenon. It does not strike at the beginning, when everything is new. It does not strike at the very end, when release is close enough to taste. It strikes after the psychological midpoint. It arrives at the moment a person realizes that as much isolation still lies ahead as has already been endured. The finish line offers no comfort yet, and the novelty has long since burned away. Mood falls. Sleep frays. Small frictions between crewmates grow teeth. A Mars crew would meet that point somewhere in the dark between two worlds. There would be no coastline to surface toward, and no dome door to open. The dip would arrive with Earth reduced to a pale point of light, and Mars still a cold disk ahead. This is why the analog missions matter so much. The dome on the mountain, the polar stations, the long submarine deployments. Each one is a rehearsal for a state of mind that cannot be fully understood until it is survived. Each one lets researchers watch the third quarter appear in ordinary, healthy volunteers, so that the first real crew is not the first to meet it. But even the best rehearsal leaves something out. The analog crews always knew, at some level, that the world was still there. The dome sat on a real mountain under a real sky. The polar station stood on solid ground. Rescue was distant, but it was not impossible. The mind can hold a great deal of hardship when it knows the world has not truly vanished. What no rehearsal on Earth can supply is the deeper knowledge waiting for the Mars traveler. The knowledge that the ground itself is gone, that the nearest solid world is a destination, not a flaw, that the silence outside is not the engineered hush of a chamber, but the genuine soundlessness of a place where sound has no meaning. And still, against all of this, the same isolation has produced something that looks almost like its opposite. Not every mind that reaches the deep quiet is broken by it. Some are transformed. In 1987, a writer named Frank White gave this transformation a name. He called it the overview effect. He arrived at the idea after interviewing dozens of astronauts and cosmonauts about what changed in them above the Earth. Again and again, they described the same shift. Seeing the whole planet at once rearranged something in the mind. The borders they had grown up believing in simply were not there. The Earth appeared as one small, fragile, unbroken thing, suspended in a blackness that went on without end. The overview effect and the terror of the silence are not separate experiences. They are two faces of the same confrontation. Both begin when a human being is placed against the true scale of the void. One face is dread, The mind meets an emptiness with no medium, no sound, no edge, and it recoils from a place that seems to hold nothing of itself. The other face is revelation. The same emptiness, seen a certain way, throws the living world into unbearable clarity. The planet becomes precious precisely because the dark around it is so complete. The astronauts who orbited the moon lived on the knife between these two faces. Behind them lay the loud, breathing, blue world. Before them lay the silence that the physics could not soften. Every one of them carried both home. The wonder and the weight. This is one reason so few have ever gone. Beyond the reach of low orbit, only a small handful of human beings have ever travelled at all. For more than half a century, that number barely moved. The deep silence was left mostly to the machines. Now that stillness is about to receive company again. A new generation of missions is preparing to send people back toward the moon, and eventually toward Mars. The engineers who design these journeys no longer treat the mind as an afterthought. They study the third quarter and the Antarctic stare. They measure how a crew sleeps when the fans never stop and the horizon never changes. They rehearse the isolation in domes and chambers and frozen stations, searching for every failure before it can appear where no rescue can reach. But the deepest question remains open. No experiment has ever combined all of the pressures at once. The true acoustic silence of the vacuum, the stretched and broken line to home, the confinement with no door and no floor, the long crossing that carries a crew past the midpoint of their endurance, while both worlds hang out of reach. Each piece has been studied alone. None has been faced together by a living mind. Consider first the thread that ties a crew to home. On the moon, that thread is almost taut. A radio signal crosses the gap in about 1 1/3 seconds. A word spoken on the surface reaches Earth before the speaker has finished the next one. Conversation still works. It is delayed, but it is alive. Mars breaks even that fragile comfort. A one-way signal between Earth and Mars takes anywhere from about 3 minutes to 22 minutes. The exact figure depends on where the two planets sit in their orbits. When the worlds swing far apart, a single message spends more than 20 minutes in flight. The reply spends another 20 minutes coming back. Real-time conversation becomes physically impossible. There is no way to ask a question and hear an answer. A crew can only send, and wait, and send again. Every exchange becomes a letter dropped into a deep well. The well answers slowly, and it never answers now. NASA and aerospace researchers who study these missions rank this delay among the most serious psychological stresses of a multi-year journey to Mars. It sits on top of the physical isolation, not beside it. The distance already separates the body. The delay then separates the conversation itself. A mind in trouble cannot reach across that gap for comfort in the moment. It must hold on alone until the moment has already passed. There is a strange lesson hidden in who breaks and who endures. Compare two groups who live at the very edge of human tolerance. Submarine crews spend months sealed inside a quiet hull. Their world is cramped and monotonous, and often genuinely still. Astronauts live the opposite life. They float inside a shell that never stops humming. Fans, pumps and machinery fill their ears without a single pause. One group is buried in silence, the other is buried in noise. And yet both groups develop the same kind of psychological strain. That symmetry points to something important. If silence itself were the enemy, the submariners should suffer while the astronauts were spared. If noise itself were the enemy, the pattern should reverse. Neither happens. Researchers who study both populations reach a careful conclusion. The deepest stress does not come from the volume of the environment at all. It comes from the loss of control over one's own sensory world. It comes from the loss of ordinary social contact. A human mind can tolerate silence, and it can tolerate noise. What it struggles to bear is having no say in either. It struggles when the condition lasts for months, with no door it is allowed to open. This helps explain a stranger discovery, one made inside the brain itself. Silence is not always quiet on the inside. Researchers have studied people who live with tinnitus, the experience of hearing a sound that has no outside source. Using a brain imaging method called functional near-infrared spectroscopy, they watch the auditory cortex during moments of real external silence. In most people, that region grows calmer when the outside world falls quiet. In people with tinnitus, it does not. The auditory cortex stays active, as though a sound were still playing. The silence outside never becomes silence inside. This is one proposed reason for a familiar paradox. A perfectly quiet room can feel loud. When the brain loses its steady stream of outside sound, it does not simply switch off. It keeps listening, and a listening brain with nothing to hear can begin to generate signal on its own. That is the quiet engine behind the phantom sounds people describe in the deepest chambers on Earth. The high hiss of nerve fibers firing without instruction. The soft rush of one's own blood moving. The faint impression of a sound that no instrument in the room is making. The listener is not imagining a defect. The listener is hearing the machinery that normal noise usually hides. The same pattern runs through everything the isolation studies uncovered. Take away the world, and the mind does not rest. It fills the empty place. The volunteers, wrapped in soft goggles and steady noise, did not drift into blank calm. They heard music that no one played. They felt themselves struck by objects that did not exist. The men who floated in warm and lightless water met visions rather than emptiness. The lesson repeats across decades and across methods. The human nervous system is built to expect input. When the input stops, the system does not stop with it. It begins to write its own. Now turn the whole question around. So far, the silence and the isolation appear only as threats. They break sleep. They bend mood. They fill the mind with sounds that were never made. But the very same conditions have produced something else. Something almost opposite in feeling. In 1987, the space writer Frank White gave that something a name. He called it the overview effect. White arrived at the idea after interviewing dozens of astronauts and cosmonauts. He wanted to know what changes in a person who has seen the whole Earth at once. Many of the spacefarers described the same quiet shift. From orbit, and from the far greater distance of the Moon, the planet stops being a map. It becomes a single fragile object hanging in the dark. The borders disappear, the old arguments shrink. The thin shell of atmosphere that holds every living thing looks alarmingly slight from the outside. Many who felt it came home changed in ways they could not fully explain. This is the other face of deep space isolation. The distance that isolates a mind can also widen it. The same view that left Michael Collins feeling utterly alone behind the Moon left others feeling bound to everything at once. Both reactions are real. Both come from the same silence and the same dark. The void does not deliver a single verdict on the mind that meets it. It offers a fracture, and it offers a kind of clarity, and it does not announce in advance which one it will give. So the picture grows more complicated the closer it is examined. The silence of deep space is total and physical. The isolation is genuine and measurable. Yet the mind that faces both does not respond in one predictable way. It can splinter under phantom sound, and it can fall into sudden peace. It can lose its grip on time, and it can find a wider sense of belonging. Which response arrives may depend less on the void itself than on the person who enters it. It may depend on how much of their own world they are still allowed to hold while they are there. That is the hardest thing to prepare for, because control cannot easily be packed for the journey. On Earth, a person under strain can walk outside, call a friend, or simply change the room around them. Each small act restores a little authority over the senses. Strip those acts away, and the ordinary tools of self-repair vanish with them. A crew far from home cannot step outside. They cannot reach anyone in real time once the delay stretches long. They cannot change the horizon, because the horizon is only more distance. The designers of these missions understand this now. They no longer ask only whether the body can survive the crossing. They ask whether the mind can keep its footing when nearly every familiar handhold has been removed, and that returns the whole story to a single unresolved knot. The physics of the silence is settled. Space is soundless, because there is almost nothing there to carry a wave. The illusion of sound is understood, because sonification only translates invisible signals into something the ear can accept. The engineered quiet of Earth has been built and measured and certified. The psychology of that quiet is still argued over, still tangled between real physiological sounds and disputed reports of collapse. Each thread has been followed a long way on its own. What no one has yet watched is all of them pulled tight at the same time, around the same living crew, for the same uninterrupted span of years. The pieces that remain untested are not small ones. There is the true acoustic silence of the vacuum, pressing on a hull far from any help. There is the stretched and severed line to home, where a cry for reassurance takes half an hour to land. There is the confinement with no floor beneath it and no door within reach. And there is the sheer length of the passage, long enough to carry a crew past the psychological midpoint that has undone so many isolated groups before them. Each of these has bent a mind in the studies. None has been asked to bend a mind together, all at once, with the nearest rescue measured not in hours, but in months. That is where the science now stands, and where it must go next. The chambers have shown what a few minutes of perfect quiet can do. The analog domes have shown what a year of confinement can do. The lonely orbit behind the moon has shown what true separation feels like for a single human being for the space of an hour at a time. But the journey ahead will not hand these pressures out one by one, in doses a laboratory can control. It will deliver them combined and sustained, in a place where the only mind available to steady the crew is the crew's own. The instruments can measure almost everything on that voyage. The one variable they cannot fully predict is the one riding inside the ship. Consider what that separation will actually feel like from inside the cabin. On the road to the moon, a spoken word still reaches Earth quickly. A radio signal crosses that distance in roughly 1 1/3 seconds. A crew can ask a question and hear an answer almost within the rhythm of ordinary conversation. Mission control feels close. The planet feels close. The voice on the other end arrives before the loneliness has time to settle. The road to Mars offers no such comfort. Depending on where the two planets sit in their orbits, a single one-way signal takes anywhere from about 3 minutes to 22 minutes to cross the gap. A greeting sent from the ship must travel that entire distance before anyone on Earth can hear it. The reply must travel the same distance back. At the worst alignment, one simple exchange can consume the better part of an hour. Real-time conversation becomes physically impossible. The crew cannot talk with home. They can only send messages into the dark and wait. Aerospace researchers have studied this delay with care. They identify it as one of the most significant psychological stressors of any multi-year Mars mission. It is not the raw distance that presses hardest on the mind. It is the loss of the immediate human reply. On Earth, a frightened person can call someone and be answered in the same breath. On the way to Mars, fear must be spoken, then archived, then carried across the void, long after the moment that produced it has passed. Comfort always arrives late. Every reassurance is already history by the time it is heard. Sometimes the link will not arrive at all. When the sun moves between the two planets, it can drown the signal entirely, and the crew is cut off completely for a stretch of days. This is not the brief pass behind the moon that swallowed a single astronaut for the space of an hour. This is a planned and unavoidable blackout, timed by the geometry of the solar system itself. The crew will know it is coming. They will watch it approach on the calendar. And then, for a time, they will be the most isolated human beings who have ever lived, unable to hear the world that made them. This is the strange truth the silence of deep space finally reveals. The vacuum outside the ship is soundless, because there is nothing to carry a sound. But the deeper silence, the one that actually wears on people, is not made of physics at all. It is made of delay. It is the silence of a question with no answer yet. It is the quiet of a planet that can no longer speak in time. The physical vacuum is only the setting. The human vacuum is the loss of the fast, forgiving, back-and-forth contact that every mind on Earth has always taken for granted. There is a way to test which silence truly matters, and it comes from an unexpected comparison. Consider two groups of people who live sealed away from the ordinary world. One group rides in submarines, the other rides in spacecraft. On the surface, their conditions could hardly be more opposite. A submarine crew endures genuine acoustic quiet. The hull is cramped and monotonous. The outside world is a dark, pressing ocean that offers almost nothing to the senses. A space crew endures the reverse. The station around them never stops humming with fans and pumps and machinery. Their world is loud, close and mechanical, hour after hour, with no true quiet anywhere aboard. By the logic of literal silence, these two groups should suffer in completely different ways. One is starved of sound, the other is flooded with it. And yet the research finds something remarkable. Submariners and astronauts develop strikingly similar patterns of isolation strain. The same frayed moods appear, the same interpersonal friction appears, the same slow erosion of morale appears. The presence or absence of noise does not decide the outcome. That tells scientists something important about what actually harms the mind in extreme confinement. It is not the sound level. It is the loss of control over one's own sensory world and the loss of easy contact with other people. The submariner and the astronaut are both trapped inside an environment they cannot change. Neither can step outside. Neither can choose a different view, a different room, a different sky. Neither can reach the wider human world whenever they wish. It is that loss of control, more than any measured level of quiet or noise, that grinds against the mind. Silence, in the end, is only one face of a much larger deprivation, and yet silence has its own particular power to unsettle us, and the reason lies inside the brain itself. Recall the anechoic chambers, where visitors sit in a quiet so complete that they finally hear their own bodies. Blood moving, a faint high hiss with no source in the room. Those sounds are real, generated within the listener, and they only become audible when everything else falls away. But there is a further layer to this, discovered through brain imaging, and it explains why perfect quiet can feel less like peace and more like pressure. Researchers have studied the brains of people who live with tinnitus, the condition of hearing a constant ringing or tone that has no external source. Using a technique that reads activity in the brain through faint changes in blood flow, called functional near-infrared spectroscopy, they watched what happens in the hearing centers of the brain during moments of outer silence. In a person without tinnitus, the auditory cortex settles when the world goes quiet. There is nothing to process, so the region grows calm. In a person with tinnitus, that calm never comes. When the outside world falls silent, their auditory cortex stays switched on, active and busy, as though a real sound were still playing. The silence outside does nothing to quiet the noise within. This offers one proposed reason why total silence can feel loud. The brain expects a certain background of sound at all times. When that background vanishes, the hearing system does not simply rest. In some people it strains, searching, filling the emptiness with signals of its own. The high whine reported in the quietest rooms on Earth may partly be this. Nerve cells that carry sound to the brain can fire on their own, without any sound to trigger them, and the mind, finding no other explanation, hears them as a faint tone. The listener is not imagining it. The ear is genuinely generating a sound where the world has left none. Put these findings beside one another, and a picture forms of why the silence of deep space troubles the human mind so deeply. We are not built for it. Every part of our hearing evolved inside a world that is always speaking. Wind, water, insects, voices, footsteps, the endless low murmur of a living planet. Our brains treat that murmur as the baseline of reality. Remove it, and the mind does not relax into the gap. It leans into it, expecting something, and when nothing comes, it begins to supply the missing signal itself. A perfectly quiet room becomes a stage for the body's own noises and the nerve's own errors. The quiet is not soothing. It is a question the brain cannot stop trying to answer. Now carry that fragile, sound-hungry brain out past the moon. Seal it inside a cabin humming with machinery, so it never truly meets the vacuum's silence directly. Cut its fast contact with home to a delay of minutes, then to a blackout of days. Confine it with the same small group of faces for years, in a space it cannot leave, past the psychological midpoint that has bent so many isolated crews before. The deep space silence outside the hull is absolute and physical. But the silence that will test the crew is stranger and closer. It is the silence of a reply that has not arrived. It is the quiet inside a room that can never be left. It is the hush a brain fills with its own uneasy sounds when the world it was built for is suddenly, impossibly out of reach. This is why the physics and the psychology cannot be separated in this story. The empty space between the planets is soundless for one clean reason: the absence of a medium to carry a wave. But the human response to that emptiness is built from many pressures at once, layered and compounding. Loss of contact. Loss of control. A brain that treats quiet as a problem to be solved. A body that begins to announce itself when nothing else will. None of these appears alone in a laboratory dose on the way to Mars. They arrive together, and they stay. The engineers can harden the ship against radiation and cold and the failure of 1,000 parts. They can carry water and air and food for years. They can rehearse every mechanical emergency until the responses are automatic. What they cannot fully carry and cannot fully rehearse is the effect of all this silence on the people inside. The chambers measured minutes. The domes measured months. The lonely orbit behind the moon measured a single mind for the space of an hour. The voyage ahead will measure something none of these ever reached, and it will do the measuring in real time, with living people, far beyond the reach of any quick correction from home. Consider the simplest thing a crew leaving Earth begins to lose. A conversation. On the surface of the moon, a spoken word reaches home in roughly 1 1/3 seconds. A reply returns just as quickly. The delay is short enough that talk still feels like talk. Two people can trade sentences, argue, and finish each other's thoughts. That thin thread of near-instant contact held every Apollo crew to the planet they had left. It was proof that home was still listening. Mars severs that thread. A single radio signal from Earth to Mars takes anywhere from about 3 minutes to about 22 minutes to arrive. The exact figure depends on where the two planets sit in their orbits. Then the reply must cross the same distance again. In the worst case, a question asked from the ship waits more than 40 minutes for its answer. Real conversation becomes physically impossible. Not merely difficult, impossible. The laws of physics forbid it. There is a particular cruelty in that arrangement. A message of fear or joy or apology leaves the ship and travels for many minutes across the dark. By the time a voice from home replies, the feeling that prompted it may already have passed. The crew and the planet fall out of step. They share words but never a moment. For people raised on instant reply, that steady lag becomes its own kind of silence. It is not the absence of sound, it is the absence of presence. The delay reshapes every emergency. On Earth, a doctor can guide a frightened patient through a crisis word by word. In orbit, a flight surgeon can do nearly the same. On the way to Mars, no such hand can reach across the gap in time. A crew facing injury or illness must decide and act before any expert on Earth even learns that something has gone wrong. The distance turns each of them into the last authority on their own survival. NASA and aerospace researchers name this communication delay among the most significant psychological stressors of any multi-year Mars mission. It sits on top of the isolation, not beside it. So the agencies rehearse. If they cannot yet send a crew to Mars, they can build a small version of the loneliness and study who survives it well. On the barren high slopes of Mauna Loa in Hawaii, a research dome was raised, roughly 1,200 square feet across. Inside it lived crews of 6 volunteers at a time. The program carried a long name, the Hawaii Space Exploration Analog and Simulation. Between 2013 and 2016, successive crews sealed themselves inside for missions of 4 months, then 8 months, then a full 12 months. The rules mimicked a real voyage. Every trip outside the dome required a mock spacesuit. Contact with the outside world was limited and slowed on purpose. The landscape around them was volcanic rock, chosen because it resembles the surface of Mars more than almost anywhere on Earth. The point was never the rock. The point was the people. Researchers watched how mood, cognition, and crew cohesion bent under the weight of confinement. They wanted to know what breaks first, when 6 human beings cannot leave and cannot escape one another. Confinement strips the ordinary escapes a person never notices. There is no walk to clear the head. There is no door to close on an argument. There is no new face across a room. The same 6 people wake, work, eat and sleep within the same curved walls for the length of a school year. The researchers were not truly studying rock or spacesuits. They were studying the slow arithmetic of the same faces, day after day, with the horizons sealed behind glass. What these studies keep finding is stranger than simple loneliness. Isolation does not wear the mind down at a steady rate. It has a shape. Across Antarctic winter over crews, submarine patrols and Mars analog missions, researchers repeatedly describe something called the third quarter phenomenon. It is a distinct low point, and it does not arrive when you would expect. It does not come at the hardest moment or the final stretch. It comes just after the psychological midpoint of the confinement. The trigger appears to be a realization rather than an event. Somewhere past the middle, a participant understands that as much isolation still lies ahead as has already passed. The finish line, once imaginable, recedes. In that stretch, the records show a clear rise in sleep disturbance, negative mood, impaired thinking, and conflict between crewmates. People who had coped for months begin to fray. Some researchers describe a related state they call the Antarctic stare. It is a kind of fugue, a drifting of attention, a dulling of awareness in a person who has run out of new things to notice. None of this is weakness. These are ordinary, capable, carefully chosen people. They are pilots and scientists and engineers, selected in part for their steadiness under pressure. The strain does not spare them because they are strong. It reaches them because the human mind was shaped by a world of contact and change. It does not do well when both are taken away. The stare and the sinking mood are not failures of character. They are what a healthy brain does when the environment stops feeding it. The pattern matters because it is predictable. If crews reliably sync at the same point, mission planners can prepare for it. They can schedule lighter work, arrange extra contact, or simply warn the crew that the low is coming and will pass. A danger anticipated is a danger halved. But on the way to Mars, even that warning must cross the widening gap between the ship and everyone who might offer it. Here the science turns a common assumption on its head. It is tempting to believe that silence itself is the enemy. Yet compare 2 kinds of confined human. A submariner endures genuine quiet and sensory monotony inside a cramped, hushed hull. An astronaut endures the opposite, trapped in the constant mechanical roar of the machines keeping the crew alive. One has too little sound, the other has too much. By the silence theory, they should suffer in opposite ways. They do not. Both groups develop strikingly similar isolation-driven strain. The submariner in the quiet and the astronaut in the noise arrive at the same psychological place. That similarity points away from sound as the root cause. What both crews truly lose is control. Control over what they hear, control over who they see, control over when the confinement ends. It is the loss of command over one's own sensory and social world, far more than literal silence, that most stresses the mind in extreme confinement. The quiet is a symbol of that helplessness. It is rarely the whole of it. A ship bound for Mars folds both pressures into one journey. For the first time, a crew may face genuine acoustic quiet on the long cruise between worlds, together with the near-total loss of quick contact with home. Apollo touched only the second of these, and only for days. The dome on Mauna Loa touched only the first side of it, and only within easy reach of rescue. No mission yet flown has combined the true silence of the deep with a home that cannot answer in time. That combination is still theory. It waits for the first crew to prove what it does. And yet the quiet is never truly empty for the brain that listens to it. The nervous system does not tolerate an absence of signal for long. It begins to generate one. This shows most clearly in people who live with tinnitus, the persistent perception of a sound with no external source. Brain imaging using a technique called functional near-infrared spectroscopy has watched what happens in their heads during real external silence. In a person without tinnitus, quiet lets the auditory cortex settle. The hearing centers grow calm because there is nothing to process. In a person with tinnitus, the opposite occurs. During silence, their auditory cortex stays hyperactive. It fires as though a real sound were still playing. The brain refuses the emptiness and manufactures a substitute. It is one proposed reason a perfectly silent room can feel subjectively loud. The silence is not the sound they hear. The silence is what lets the phantom sound take over. So the mind, left alone, does not simply endure an empty room. It works. It fills the quiet with its own signal. It counts the days and knows exactly when it is halfway to nowhere. It reaches for a voice that will not answer for many minutes, and it feels the gap as a wound. But filling the silence with phantom sound is only one of the things a mind does when the world falls away. Given the right view, it can be flooded instead. It can be overwhelmed by a single sight large enough to rearrange a person's sense of everything they thought they knew. The sight is the whole Earth seen at once, from far enough away that it fits inside a single window. On the ground, a person can never truly see the planet. They see a street, they see a field, they see a horizon that curves away and hides the rest. From orbit and from the distance of the moon, the entire world becomes one object. It hangs in the black with nothing around it. There is no frame, no background, no second thing to set beside it. And many of the people who have seen it describe the same strange rearrangement of the mind. In 1987, the space philosopher Frank White gave that rearrangement a name. He called it the overview effect. He arrived at the term after interviewing dozens of astronauts and cosmonauts. He was not asking about the physics of flight. He was asking about the mind. He wanted to know what changed in a person who looked back at the whole Earth. And the answers converged on something that sounded almost identical from one traveler to the next. They described a profound cognitive shift. It was not a mood. It was not a passing thrill. It was a durable change in how they understood their own planet. The Earth from that distance looks fragile. Its atmosphere reads as a thin, bright film wrapped around the surface. The film is thinner than almost anyone imagines from below. The borders that organize life on the ground simply vanish. There are no drawn lines between nations from orbit. There is one continuous surface holding everything that has ever lived. That feeling of borderless unity was the second half of what White heard. The planet stops looking like a map. It starts looking like a single living thing. And the effect appears to arrive on its own. The travelers did not decide to feel it. It happened to them when the whole world entered the frame. A view large enough to hold the entire species turns out to be large enough to reorder a mind. Here the two halves of this story meet. The empty dark starves the senses until the mind invents what is missing. The whole Earth floods the senses until the mind can barely hold what it is given. One is absence, the other is overflow, yet both come from the same source. Both arrive from being placed at a scale the human body was never built to occupy. The silence and the sight are two faces of one immensity. This raises an uncomfortable question. If silence itself were the true danger, then the quietest crews on Earth should suffer the most. They do not. Consider two groups who live at opposite ends of the sound spectrum. Submarine crews spend months sealed inside a hull. Their world is genuinely quiet and deeply monotonous. Nothing changes for weeks at a time. The same corridors, the same faces, the same enclosed hum beneath the floor. Astronauts live in the opposite condition. They are trapped inside constant mechanical noise that never once stops. By any simple theory, these two groups should break in opposite ways. They do not. Both develop strikingly similar psychological strain under long confinement. The submariner in near silence and the astronaut in ceaseless noise arrive at the same place. That similarity is the clue. It tells researchers that literal silence is not the wound. The deeper injury is the loss of control over one's own sensory world. It is the loss of choice about what to hear. It is the loss of choice about what to see and who to speak to. A person can endure remarkable quiet if they chose it and can leave it. The same quiet becomes unbearable when it is imposed and cannot be escaped. The mind does not fear the emptiness. It fears having no say in it. If confinement rather than quiet is the real hazard, then it can be studied without ever leaving the ground. That is exactly what one program set out to do. On the barren volcanic slopes of Mauna Loa in Hawaii, scientists built a small dome and filled it with volunteers who agreed to be sealed away. The site was chosen because it looks and feels alien. The ground is high and cold and stripped of nearly all life. It sits closer to a Martian landscape than almost anywhere else on our planet. The program was called High Seas, the Hawaii Space Exploration Analog and Simulation. Between 2013 and 2016, it ran a series of isolation missions inside that dome. Each crew held 6 people. Their entire home measured only about 1,200 square feet. Every time they stepped outside, they pulled on a mock spacesuit, as if the thin mountain air were a killing vacuum. They could not simply walk out for relief. Even the open sky had to be earned through a ritual of enclosure. The missions grew longer as the program advanced. One ran 4 months. One ran 8 months. One stretched to a full 12 months of confinement with the same 5 other people. The purpose was never to test the dome. The purpose was to test the crews. Researchers watched their mood across the weeks. They watched their thinking sharpen or blur. They watched their ability to hold together as a group under strain. They wanted to know what a small sealed team does to itself across the length of a real voyage to another world. The findings were sobering in their consistency. Isolation does not stay flat over time. It has a shape. Long confinement studies repeatedly find that the hardest stretch is not the beginning and not the end. It is the passage just after the midpoint. That is the moment a crew realizes as much isolation still lies ahead as has already been endured. Sleep degrades. Mood darkens. Small irritations between crewmates sharpen into real conflict. The body has held on for months, and now learns it must hold on for months more. Researchers even describe a fugue-like drift that can settle over people in extreme confinement. Attention wanders, situational awareness thins. A person can stare at a task and not fully register it. The mind, given too little to work with for too long, begins to loosen its grip on the present. These are not the failures of weak individuals. They appear in trained, screened, capable crews. They are what the human system does when it is held too long in a place too small and too far from home. These rehearsals matter because the real thing remains almost untried. For all the decades of spaceflight, the number of people who have ever traveled beyond low Earth orbit is astonishingly small. It is 28. That is the entire count in the whole history of our species. The first 24 were Apollo astronauts. They were carried out there between 1968 and 1972. Then the number stopped. For more than 53 years it did not move at all. The door to deep space opened, and then it closed, and it stayed closed for over half a century. It began to move again only with Artemis E. In April of 2026, 4 astronauts flew a crude loop around the moon. Their names were Reed Wiseman and Victor Glover. With them flew Christina Koch and Jeremy Hansen. They were the first human beings in over 50 years to leave the near shore of Earth. On that flight, they set a new record for human distance from home. At their farthest point, they were 252,756 miles away. That distance is worth holding in the mind for a moment. It is the farthest any living person has ever been from everyone and everything they know, and it is still only a lunar flyby. The moon is close. Its light reaches us in barely more than a second. A radio call still returns almost at once. The crew of Artemis II carried the record for human distance, yet they never lost the thread that ties a mind back to Earth. They could still speak and be answered. They could still see the planet whole, hanging behind them, small but never gone. Everything the analog domes rehearse waits at the far end of a distance greater than that. Everything the silent studies predict waits there too. A voyage to Mars would carry a crew far past the point Artemis reached. It would carry them past the last place where Earth still looks like home. Out there, the planet shrinks to a point of light among other points. The whole world that produced the overview effect would no longer fill a window. It would become one more star. And that is the gap no dome and no anechoic room has ever fully reproduced. The chamber in Minneapolis can strip away sound, but the door is a few steps behind you. The dome on Mauna Loa can seal away the world, but real air waits just outside the mock suit. Even the astronaut behind the moon was gone from contact for only minutes at a time before the planet swung him back into the light of home. A crew bound for Mars would face something none of these rehearsals contain in full. They would carry genuine acoustic silence in the dark between the vibrations of their own machines. They would carry confinement measured not in months but in years. And they would carry a separation from Earth that no radio call can close in time. The immensity that empties one mind and floods another would press on them from every side at once. The silence, the smallness and the distance would arrive together, and there would be nowhere on the ship to step outside. So the question the anechoic chamber first raised has never gone quiet. It only grew larger. A perfectly silent room breaks a curious visitor in under an hour. A sealed dome strains a trained crew across a single year. And beyond the moon waits a silence deeper than either, held for longer than either, with the whole Earth reduced to a spark behind the glass. The mind has been tested against the edges of that silence. It has not yet been tested against the whole of it. Yet a strange finding sits at the center of all this testing. The thing that breaks the mind may not be the silence itself. To see why, consider 2 groups who live at the far edges of human confinement. Submarine crews and astronauts endure almost opposite conditions. A submarine runs quiet by design. Its crew moves through a cramped hull in near acoustic monotony. The sea outside carries no voices and no news. For weeks the same faces pass the same narrow corridors. The silence there is real and heavy and close. An astronaut lives inside the reverse of that. The station around him never stops making noise. Fans and pumps press against his ears at every hour. He is not starved of sound. He is flooded by it. And yet these 2 groups arrive at the same place. One is silenced. One is deafened. Both develop the same isolation strain. Both report the same slow erosion of mood and focus. Researchers who study extreme confinement noticed this pattern and drew a careful conclusion. The damage does not come from silence. It does not come from noise. It comes from losing control over your own sensory world. It comes from losing contact with other minds. That loss of contact has a measurable size. On the moon, a radio signal reaches Earth in about 1 1/3 seconds. A crew can speak, wait a single heartbeat, and hear an answer. The conversation still feels alive. Mars removes even that thin thread. A signal from Mars takes anywhere from 3 to 22 minutes to cross the gap. The exact delay depends on where the 2 planets sit in their orbits. A single question and its answer can eat most of an hour. Real-time conversation becomes physically impossible. There is no way to shorten it. No clever engineering can outrun the speed of light across that distance. A Mars crew cannot call home and be comforted in the moment. They can only send a message into the dark and wait for the dark to answer. Aerospace researchers name this delay one of the heaviest psychological burdens of a Mars mission. The isolation is not only physical, it is written into the laws of physics themselves. Long isolation also has a shape in time. It does not press evenly across the months. Researchers studied Antarctic winter cruise, submarine patrols, and Mars analog missions. They found a strange low point in the data. It does not arrive at the beginning, when the strangeness is fresh. It does not arrive at the hardest physical moment. It arrives just after the halfway mark. They call it the third quarter phenomenon. Something shifts once a crew crosses the psychological midpoint of their confinement. The people inside look ahead and see a hard truth. As much isolation still remains as they have already survived. The finish line sits no closer than the start did. And the mind reacts. Sleep begins to break apart. Mood darkens without a clear cause. Small tasks grow harder to hold in memory. Old irritations between crewmates sharpen into open conflict. The worst strain comes not from any single crisis. It comes from the sheer measured length of what is still left to endure. Some researchers describe a related state seen deep in the polar winter. They call it the Antarctic stare. It is a kind of waking absence. Attention slips loose from the moment. Situational awareness fades away. A person can sit with open eyes and slowly stop registering the room around them. The mind, given too little to hold and too little to reach toward, begins to empty on its own. This is the same hollowing the anechoic chamber produced in minutes, now stretched across an entire season. Remove enough of the world, for long enough, and the mind does not simply wait. It starts to come apart at the seams of attention. There is a further clue hidden in how the brain treats silence itself. The auditory system is not a passive microphone. It expects input. When that input falls away, it does not always fall quiet with it. Brain imaging offers one striking example. Researchers studied people who live with tinnitus, the perception of a sound with no external source. They watched the auditory cortex during moments of genuine external silence. In a person without tinnitus, that region calms when the sound stops. In a person with tinnitus, it does not. It stays active, as if a sound were still playing, when nothing is there. This hints at why deep silence can feel loud rather than empty. The brain is built to detect sound against a background. Take the background away, and the system may keep searching. It may amplify its own internal signals to fill the missing space. The faint hiss a visitor hears in the quietest room may be the sound of a nervous system straining to hear anything at all. So the silence of deep space is not only an absence outside the body. It meets a nervous system that refuses to accept absence. The vacuum offers nothing to hear. The brain answers by manufacturing something to listen to. Bring these findings together, and a fuller picture forms of what a Mars crew would actually meet. Not one stressor, but several, layered and reinforcing. A sensory world they cannot control. A separation from Earth that physics will never shorten. A confinement long enough to summon the third quarter low. And a nervous system that treats true silence as a problem it must solve. Every earlier rehearsal isolated only one of these. The anechoic chamber gave pure silence, but only for minutes. The Antarctic base gave length, but kept its crew on solid ground beneath a real sky. The submarine gave confinement, but home was only a slow ascent away. The station gave distance, but kept Earth a bright familiar shape in the window, and a voice a heartbeat below. A Mars transit would fold all of them into a single unbroken passage. No prior crew has ever carried the full set at once. That is why the researchers cannot yet fully predict what such a journey would do to a person. They can measure the pieces one at a time. They cannot yet measure the whole. Each piece alone has already proven strong enough to break trained and prepared people. What their combination does across years remains an open question. and it is not a small one. The one man who came closest to the pure version of that solitude still faced it in fragments. Michael Collins felt the weight of that separation for less than an hour at a time. Each pass behind the moon returned him to his crew and to Earth's voice within a single orbit. His radio blackout had a known end, and that ending was never far. A crew bound for Mars would carry a version of his solitude that does not close at the next sunrise. His silence lasted minutes. Theirs would be measured in years. His horizon was one lunar orbit. Theirs would stretch across the emptiest road humans have ever attempted to cross. And so the research slowly turns. It moves away from measuring the silence and toward measuring the mind that must survive it. The question is no longer only what deep space sounds like, or fails to sound like. It is what happens to a person when the entire world contracts to a sealed room and a distant spark. It is whether the human mind, shaped over millions of years by wind and voices and the constant murmur of a living planet, can hold itself together when none of that follows. The instruments have mapped the physical silence with great precision. The harder measurement has only begun. What the analog missions have shown is that the mind does not stay neutral in that emptiness. It fills the space. It fills it with phantom sounds, with sharpened fears, with the slow drift of the polar stare. It reaches for contact and finds a delay it cannot argue with. This is the deeper reason the silence of deep space unsettles us. It is not a wall we run into. It is a mirror. Strip away the noise and the news and the answering voice, and the mind turns inward and begins to hear itself. What it hears there is not always something it is ready to face. Consider what the brain does when the outside world falls quiet. In most people, the hearing centers settle. The neurons that listen grow calm when there is nothing to hear. This system was built for a living world, and that world is rarely still. When quiet does arrive, the listening machinery can rest. But this is not true for everyone. For some people, silence is never truly silent. Researchers have studied this with a method called functional near-infrared spectroscopy. It watches activity in the brain by tracking small changes in blood flow. The work focused on people who live with tinnitus. Tinnitus is the sense of a sound that has no source in the outside world. It can be a ringing, a hiss, or a thin, steady tone. For many people, it never fully stops. The imaging revealed something telling. In a person without tinnitus, external silence lets the auditory cortex wind down. In a person with tinnitus, that winding down does not occur. The auditory cortex stays active while the room is quiet. It behaves as if a real sound were still playing. The brain, starved of input, appears to supply its own. This gives one clue to a strange fact. Total silence can feel loud. It can press against a person instead of soothing them. If the listening brain refuses to rest when the room goes still, then stillness is not rest at all. It becomes a stage where the mind performs its own sounds. This is part of what visitors describe inside the great sound-absorbing chambers. The hiss they notice is not always the room. Sometimes it is the machinery of hearing, running with nothing to hear. Now carry that idea away from Earth, into the sealed rooms that travel. The mind's struggle with silence is not only about sound, it is also about control. That becomes clear when two very different groups of people are compared. Consider the submarine crew and the astronaut. On the surface, they seem to where the submariner is surrounded by silence, the astronaut is surrounded by sound. One environment removes the world of hearing, the other floods it without pause. And yet both groups arrive at a similar place. Both develop the strain that comes from long isolation. Both wrestle with confinement, with monotony, and with distance from home. This result deserves a moment of attention. One group has silence, the other has constant noise. If silence alone were the poison, only one group would suffer. Instead, both do. Scientists who study these extreme settings draw a careful lesson from this. The deepest stressor may not be silence at all. It may be the loss of control over one's own sensory world. It may be the loss of ordinary human contact. The submariner cannot step outside for air. The astronaut cannot switch off the fans. Neither can choose what reaches their senses, or when. That loss, more than quiet or noise, is what slowly wears on the mind. This reframes the whole question of deep space. We tend to imagine that the danger is the emptiness itself. We picture a person crushed by pure silence, as if quiet were a weight. But the evidence points somewhere subtler. The mind is not simply afraid of nothing. It is unsettled when it can no longer shape its own experience. Deep space takes that control away completely. There is no window to open. There is no walk to take. There is no other room. And still, the silence of deep space is not only a source of dread. It has also produced something closer to transformation. Among the small number of people who have seen Earth from far away, one experience keeps returning with striking consistency. It does not sound like fear. It sounds like awe. In 1987, a writer named Frank White gave this experience a name. He called it the overview effect. He reached the term after interviewing dozens of astronauts and cosmonauts about what they felt in space. He was listening for a pattern in their accounts. He found one. Many spacefarers describe a profound shift when they view the whole planet at once. From orbit, or from the distance of the moon, Earth becomes a single object. The borders that crowd every map are simply not there. The planet appears fragile, wrapped in a thin skin of air. People who felt this often say it changed how they understood their home and their kind. The shift was not only emotional, it was a change in how they saw reality. There is a quiet irony in where this experience occurs. The overview effect unfolds in the same vast emptiness that isolates the traveler. The distance that cuts a person off from every familiar voice is the distance that lets them see the whole Earth in one glance. The silence that presses inward is also what clears the view outward. The same conditions produce both the dread and the wonder. They are not separate places. They are two faces of the same encounter. This may be the most important thing the silence teaches. It does not act on every mind in a single way. It removes the ordinary flood of the world, and what remains is the person. For some, what remains is fear, phantom sound, and the slow drift of attention that the analog crews described. For others, what remains is clarity, and a sense of the planet as one small living thing. The emptiness does not decide which, it only opens the space in which the answer appears. We should be honest about how thin our evidence still is. The people who have felt the overview effect are few. The people who have travelled far enough to feel the true weight of deep space are fewer still. The count of humans who have gone beyond low Earth orbit remains small enough to name and study one by one. Every account is precious, and every account is personal. We are reading the earliest pages of a very long book. What we can say is that the mind does not stay neutral out there. It responds. It fills the silence with sound, or with fear, or with a strange and lasting sense of unity. The instruments can measure the air pressure and the noise floor and the exact reach of a radio signal. They cannot yet measure what a person becomes after weeks alone with a distant spark of home. That measurement is only beginning, and the conditions that will produce it are already being built. The journeys ahead will not resemble the short trips of the past. A crew bound for another world will not orbit for hours and return. They will travel for months, and then for months again. They will carry the constant noise of their machines, and they will carry the true silence of the space beyond the hull. They will face both at once, for longer than anyone has faced either. There is a further pressure waiting for them, and it has nothing to do with sound. It is the delay. A voice from home will no longer arrive in an instant. It will take minutes to cross the gap, and minutes more to answer. A conversation becomes impossible. A question and its reply can be separated by the better part of an hour. The crew will be alone in a way that even the loneliest astronauts of the past were not. Their isolation will be woven from silence, distance, and time together. No mission yet flown has combined all three. The travelers behind the moon lost contact for minutes, not for months. The crews in the isolation domes on Earth could still breathe real air and see a real sky. The station in orbit is loud, but it is close, and a voice from the ground answers at once. Each of these was a partial rehearsal. None was the full performance. The real test still lies ahead, waiting in the dark between the planets. So the question that opened this journey has not closed. It has sharpened. We know now why deep space is soundless, and why its silence is unlike anything on Earth. We know how the mind behaves when the world is stripped away, and how differently it can respond. But we do not yet know whether a human being can carry a settled mind across that emptiness for years and arrive whole on the other side. That is the measurement still to come. Consider the distance itself and what it does to a human voice. A radio signal is the fastest messenger we possess. It travels at the speed of light, and nothing overtakes it. From the Earth to the Moon, that signal crosses the gap in about 1 1/3 seconds. Collins, hidden behind the far side, lost even that thin thread, yet he was never more than a moment of light away from home. A crew bound for Mars will live inside a far longer delay. A single message from the Earth to Mars can take anywhere from about 3 minutes to about 22 minutes to arrive. The exact figure depends on where the two planets sit in their orbits. When they drift to opposite sides of the Sun, the gap widens. When they swing near, it narrows, but it never shrinks to the near-instant reply of the Moon. Think about what that delay quietly erases. A real conversation needs an answer that returns while the question is still warm. On the way to Mars, that becomes impossible. A greeting sent toward home might wait the better part of an hour before any reply returns. There is no arguing in real time. There is no swift reassurance from a familiar voice on the ground. A crew in trouble cannot ask a question and hear the answer in the same breath. They must decide alone, then wait to learn whether they were right. NASA and aerospace researchers name this communication delay as one of the gravest psychological stresses of a Mars mission. It sits on top of the physical isolation, not merely beside it. The soundlessness of deep space is one weight. The lag in every human voice is another. Together they build a kind of loneliness that no traveler has yet endured for years. Here the story turns in a direction that surprises many people. We have treated silence as the villain of this journey. The engineered rooms that break visitors in minutes seem to prove it. But the deeper research points somewhere stranger. Compare two groups who live at the far edges of human confinement. Submarine crews descend into genuine acoustic quiet and sensory monotony inside a cramped, muffled hull. Astronauts are trapped in the opposite condition, surrounded by constant mechanical noise that never stops. One group has too little sound, the other has too much. By the logic we started with, they should suffer in different ways. They do not. Both groups develop remarkably similar isolation-driven strain. The mood drops, the sleep frays, the small conflicts sharpen. That symmetry carries a lesson. If silence alone were the poison, the submariners would break, and the astronauts would not. If noise alone were the poison, the reverse would be true. Instead, the two conditions converge on the same result. Researchers who study these extreme environments draw a careful conclusion from it. The deepest stress does not come from silence itself. It comes from the loss of control over one's sensory world and one's contact with other people. The submariner cannot choose to hear a bird or a street. The astronaut cannot choose to switch off the fans that keep him alive. Both have surrendered the ordinary human power to shape what reaches the senses. That surrender, more than any single sound level, is what wears on the mind. The analog missions expose another pattern that no crew can talk its way around. Long confinement does not decline in a smooth line. It bends. Studies of Antarctic winter-over teams, of submarine patrols, and of Mars analog crews repeatedly record what researchers call the third quarter phenomenon. It is a peak in trouble that arrives after the psychological midpoint of the mission. Sleep disturbance rises. Mood darkens. Cognition dulls. Small frictions between people flare into real conflict. The timing is the cruel part. It does not strike at the beginning, when the strangeness is fresh and the resolve is strong. It strikes once the halfway mark has passed. That is the moment a person realizes that as much isolation still lies ahead as has already been survived. The relief of the midpoint curdles into a long exhale that has nowhere to land. Alongside it, some researchers describe a stranger condition they call the Antarctic stare. It is a fugue-like drift of attention, a fading of situational awareness, a mind that slips its moorings while the eyes remain open. A person in that state is present and absent at once. The world has grown so unchanging that the mind stops fully attending to it. This is not a hallucination and not a breakdown. It is closer to a slow disengagement, the attention loosening from a scene that offers nothing new. On a base surrounded by white ice and long night, the empty landscape invites it. On a spacecraft crossing months of unbroken dark, the same emptiness would wait outside every window. Return now to the phantom sounds people report inside the quietest rooms on Earth. We described the hiss and the pulse, and the faint roar of one's own body. There is a clue in the brain about why total quiet can feel so heavy. Brain imaging research using a technique that reads blood flow in the cortex has studied people who live with tinnitus, the perception of a ringing that has no outside source. In a person without tinnitus, external silence lets the auditory cortex settle. The listening machinery grows calm when there is nothing to hear. In a person with tinnitus, that settling does not happen. During stretches of real silence, their auditory cortex stays hyperactive, firing as though a sound were still present. The brain keeps listening to a signal that the world is not sending. That finding reframes the whole idea of silence. We imagine quiet as an absence, a simple nothing. But the brain does not treat it that way. The listening system is built to expect input, and when the input vanishes, it does not always fall silent in turn. Sometimes it fills the gap with signals of its own. This is one proposed reason a perfectly quiet environment can feel subjectively loud. The silence is not empty inside the skull. It is a stage cleared of every other performer, and onto it the nervous system pushes whatever it has. In the anechoic chamber, that is the blood and the breath and the spontaneous firing of the auditory nerve. In the long dark between planets, the raw material would be much the same, delivered without pause for years, and yet the record of spaceflight refuses to end on dread alone. There is a second thing that happens to human beings when they are carried far from the noise and clutter of the ground. In 1987, the space philosopher Frank White gave it a name. He called it the overview effect. He arrived at the term after interviewing dozens of astronauts and cosmonauts about what changed in them when they looked back at the whole Earth from orbit or from the moon. Again and again they described the same shift. It was not fear, it was a profound change in how they understood the planet and themselves. They spoke of the Earth's fragility, of a thin skin of air holding all of life. They spoke of borders that vanished from that height, of a single unbroken world with no lines drawn across it. Notice what surrounds those reports. The overview effect is described by people who were suspended in the same isolation we have been tracing. They were far from home, wrapped in vacuum, carried through the very silence that ought to hollow a person out, and what many of them found there was not only loneliness, it was a widening. The same distance that severs a voice can also lift the eye. The same emptiness that presses on the mind can also clear it enough to see the whole of home at once. Lovell felt an early edge of this when he called the loneliness at the moon awe-inspiring, and then in the same breath spoke of what waited back on Earth. The awe and the ache arrived together. They were not opposites. They were two faces of the same encounter with the void. This is the tension a Mars crew will carry into the dark. On one side sit the measured hazards, the communication delay that makes every human answer arrive late, the confinement that bends toward crisis in the third quarter, the unchanging scene that invites the drifting stare, the silence that the brain itself may refuse to leave alone. On the other side sits the strange gift that some travelers have brought home from far less demanding voyages: the clearing of the mind, the sense of the earth as fragile and whole. No one knows yet which of these forces wins across years rather than days. No crew has been held that long in that place to find out. That uncertainty is the true frontier here, and it is worth stating plainly. Everything we have gathered so far is a fragment of the full test. The chambers on Earth measured silence, but not distance. The isolation domes measured confinement, but under a real sky and breathable air. The station in orbit measures long duration, but bathed in noise and 1 1/3 seconds from a human reply. The men behind the moon measured true remoteness, yet only for the minutes of a single orbit. Each experiment isolated one thread of the ordeal. The voyage to Mars will braid them together and pull the braid tight for the first time. What that combined pressure does to a settled mind is not yet a fact. It is a question the next generation of travelers will have to answer with their own nerves, in a quiet no rehearsal on Earth has fully built. Consider what a single message will cost on that journey. To the moon, a spoken word reaches Earth in about 1 1/3 seconds. A crew there can almost hold a conversation, clumsy but alive, with only a short lag between question and answer. Mars breaks even that thin thread. A one-way signal between the two planets takes anywhere from about 3 minutes to about 22 minutes, depending on where each world sits in its orbit. There is no version of this delay that permits a real exchange. A traveller could speak a sentence, and the reply could not begin to arrive for a quarter of an hour. By the time it came, the moment that prompted it would be long gone. This is a different kind of silence than the vacuum outside. The vacuum is silent because it is empty. This silence is full of words that simply have not arrived yet. Aerospace researchers who study crewed Mars planning rank this communication delay among the most severe psychological stresses of the entire mission. It is not the loudness of space that threatens the mind. It is the slowness of connection. A crew in trouble cannot ask for help and expect an answer in time. They cannot share a shock and be comforted within the same feeling. Every human voice from home reaches them already old. Notice how this reframes the whole ordeal. We began with the physics of a soundless void. We are ending near something stranger. The danger was never really the absence of pressure waves. Compare two groups who live at the edges of human endurance. Submarine crews descend into genuine acoustic quiet, sealed inside a cramped hull that hums low and holds them in monotony for weeks. Astronauts live inside the opposite, trapped in constant mechanical noise that never once relents. One group has too little sound, the other has too much. By the simple theory that silence is the enemy, these two should suffer in opposite ways. They do not. Both groups develop remarkably similar strain, the same frayed patience, the same disturbed sleep, the same slow erosion of mood over long confinement. If literal silence were the poison, the submariner and the astronaut would not arrive at the same place. That they do points at a deeper cause. Researchers who study both worlds suggest the real stressor is the loss of control over one's own sensory environment and over contact with other people. It is not whether the room is quiet or loud. It is that the person inside can no longer choose. They cannot step outside. They cannot call a friend and be heard now. They cannot change the wall of sound or the wall of quiet that surrounds them. The mind, it seems, can bear almost any environment it is allowed to leave. It struggles most with the one it cannot. That word, control, may be the thread that ties every experiment in this story together. The volunteers in the McGill chamber could have walked out, and most of them did within days. Their minds rebelled not against darkness alone, but against a stillness they had agreed to and could barely tolerate. The visitor in the anechoic chamber knows the door is there, and still the pressing quiet unsettles them within the hour. The crews in the isolation domes on the volcano knew a real sky waited above the roof, and even that knowledge did not spare them the third-quarter slump. The astronaut behind the moon had no door at all. For those minutes he could not have reached another human voice by any means, no matter how urgently he tried. Take away the exit and the phone and the open sky at once. for years rather than minutes, and you have built a pressure no chamber on Earth has ever fully applied. There is one more clue about the mind and silence, and it comes from inside the brain itself. Some people live with tinnitus, a persistent ringing or hiss that has no source in the outside world. Researchers used a brain imaging method that tracks blood flow in the cortex to watch what happens when such a person sits in external quiet. In a listener without tinnitus, the hearing centers of the brain settle down when the sound around them fades. The quiet outside becomes a quiet inside. In a person with tinnitus, the opposite occurs. During the silence, their auditory cortex does not calm. It stays active, firing as though a real sound were still playing, when no sound is there at all. This is one proposed reason a truly silent place can feel loud. The ear delivers nothing, and the brain, receiving nothing, does not go dark. It reaches for signal. It amplifies. In the extreme quiet of an anechoic chamber, even a listener without tinnitus begins to hear the machinery of their own body. The pulse of blood, the faint high hiss of nerves firing on their own. The brain was built inside a world that is never fully still. Strip away every external sound, and it does not rest. It turns up its own gain and starts to listen to itself. The silence of deep space then would not arrive as emptiness. It would arrive as an invitation for the mind to fill the void with whatever it can find. And yet the record of those who have gone furthest is not only one of dread. Something else appears in the testimony, again and again, when human beings are carried far enough to see the whole of the world at once. In 1987, the space philosopher Frank White gave this thing a name. He called it the overview effect. He arrived at the term after interviewing dozens of astronauts and cosmonauts about what changed in them when they looked back at Earth from orbit or from the distance of the moon. What they described was not fear and not loneliness alone. It was a profound shift in how they understood the planet and their place upon it. They spoke of seeing Earth whole, a single sphere hung in black, with no borders visible upon it and nothing holding it up. They spoke of its fragility, a thin shell of air and water and life against an immensity that does not care. Many returned changed by it, carrying a sense of the planet as one small and shared and unexpectedly precious thing. This is the paradox that sits at the center of the whole subject. The same distance that isolates the mind can also expand it. The same silence that presses down can also open a person to a scale of thought they could not reach on the ground. The void takes something, and for some, it gives something back. Michael Collins felt both edges of that blade in a single mission. Alone in his craft behind the moon, cut off from every other human being alive, he wrote that he was truly alone and absolutely isolated from any known life. That was the pressing edge, but he also carried home the other edge, the awareness of Earth as a fragile and gleaming thing worth protecting, seen from a place almost no one has stood. Jim Lovell, speaking live from lunar orbit on that Christmas Eve, reached for the same double truth. The vast loneliness up there was awe-inspiring, he said, and it made him realize just what he had back on Earth. The loneliness and the gratitude arrived together. Neither one arrived without the other. Hold that against the number that still governs this whole history. Beyond the reach of low Earth orbit, out where the planet begins to shrink behind you and the silence becomes real, only 28 human beings in all of history have ever traveled. For more than 53 years, that count stood frozen at 24, the astronauts of the Apollo program, and then it moved at last with the crew that looped around the moon and set a new record of 252,750, 6 miles from home. 28 people. Against the billions who have ever lived, that is almost no one. The overwhelming majority of everything the human mind knows about deep space silence, it knows secondhand, from instruments and analogues and the words of a tiny handful who went and came back. So we are left holding fragments still, even now. We know the physics with certainty. Space is silent because there is almost nothing there to carry a sound, and no explosion, however near, could ever be heard across that emptiness. We know the sounds we play from space are translations, The plasma of the heliosphere and the ring of distant fields converted by mathematics into something an ear can accept. We know how to build silence on Earth, in chambers lined with wedges and steel and concrete, quieter than the threshold of hearing itself. We know those rooms unsettle people, though not always in the lurid way the story is often told. We know the station that stands in for space is not silent at all, but a droning machine that can wear on the ears across the years. We know the mind under long confinement bends in patterns we can name: the third quarter slump, the drifting stare, the slow loss of edge. What we do not yet know is what happens when all of these are joined at once and held for years. The genuine acoustic silence of the void. The communication delay that puts every human reply a quarter of an hour out of reach. The confinement without a sky above the roof. The distance beyond any rescue. No crew has ever faced that full combination. The chambers gave us silence without distance. The domes gave us confinement under real air. The station gives us duration inside noise. The men behind the moon gave us true remoteness for the length of a single orbit. Each held one thread. The braid has never been pulled tight around a single human mind.